Hi, this is my review of the Quickstart guide for Heroes and Hardships, a D10 dice pool RPG system. This is the partially complete rulebook that will give you a taste of things to come when the complete rulebook is released later this year, if I'm not mistaken. This is a universal system, but it has a unique dice pool mechanic. This is not your typical roll your dice pool, count successes, and that's how you get successful results or degrees of success. This is somewhat different. It's quite gritty, but you still have a window of opportunity for some cinematic moments. Now let's talk about the quality of this Quickstart guide that is actually free, so I recommend that you download it right away. The quality of the document is quite good. You have your hyperlinks in the table of contents, there are bookmarks, the illustrations and graphic design look awesome. I only have a nitpick and a criticism. My nitpick is that you have these embellishments at the upper and lower areas of the pages. I think they are the same, so I think it would have been better if they were different. That is, if you had a different sort of graphic on the lower part and a different one at the upper part. But like I told you, maybe it's just my nitpick. Maybe some of you will like the way that it looks. My other criticism is that a table is out of place in one of the pages, and there is a mistake when it comes to the basic attributes, the number of attributes. I counted them and they are not 10. They are 13 if I remember correctly. But those are my only criticisms. The document is well written and explained. For a quick start guide, this is quite the complete mini RPG. That is, you can play many adventures with this quick start guide, as long as you stick to one shot or short campaigns. Because if you want longer campaigns, I would definitely recommend the complete rulebook when it comes out. Later on in this review, I'm going to tell you the differences between the quick start guide and the complete rulebook. And I have to say, the illustrations are quite superb. They look like types of illustrations that you would find in the best graphic novels and the covers of some science fiction and fantasy books, so they are quite awesome. Now let's talk about the contents. First, you have an introduction giving you the design philosophy behind Heroes and Hardships. This is about any sort of game that you can think of, any sort of theme, any sort of story. So Heroes and Hardships can handle pretty much anything. But like I said, it leans a bit more towards some gritty situations with some room for cinematic moments, so I think it achieves a good balance like that. Now let's talk about what is included in the Quick Start guide. The Quick Start guide contains the D10 dice pool system, the basic rules that is. You also have the information how to create characters, more details on combat, skills and abilities, and the sort of wounds that you can suffer. Now when it comes to the core rulebook, this will include mental horrors and traumas, abilities, skills and combat actions that expand upon that which is presented in the Quick Start guide. You also have rules on magic, travel rules, mass combat, social combat, character advancement, ancestry templates. This is kind of like species and races in other role-playing games. And you also have an alternate character creation method, not as random as presented in the Quick Start guide, and many other things that are not yet mentioned. After that brief introduction, they tell you what you need to play. You need a handful of 10-sided dice. It is recommended that each player has 8 to 10 of these dice. Now, I think that the basics could be summarized like this. You have a core system based on the dice pool. This can handle any sort of situation both inside and outside of combat. But besides that, we also have a second by second type of system, similar to Hackmaster. However, this streamlines things a bit more. You won't have a number of seconds defined by the specific weapon that you are using. It's mostly defined by the actions that you are taking, regardless of the tools or weapons that you are employing. Now let's talk about the dice pool system. How is this different from your average Old World of Darkness or Era de Consortium sort of system? Well, you do have your dice pool formed by skill plus attribute or attribute plus skill. However, you can only keep a number of dice of that dice pool. That is the highest numbers that you rolled. This is not a success counting system. You add all of the numbers that you get when you roll your dice. And this is easily coded using the formula r/k. This means the number of rolled dice and the number of kept dice, or the dice that you can keep. So for example, if you have an entry that says r5k2, it means that you get to roll 5 dice, but you only get to keep 2 of the highest rolling dice from that pool. So maybe you make your roll, you roll 5 dice, and you rolled a 10 and an 8, and the others are 1, 2, and 3. Of course, you will want to keep the 8 and the 10. This is determined by your attribute. That adds a certain degree of realism or grittiness to this system. So you are still limited by your current natural characteristics. If you have a strength 3, you are limited by your strength when it comes to the results that you can get. Although there is an exploding dice mechanic, that is, if you roll the maximum number, in this case a 10 on a d10, you can keep rolling. So like I told you, there are some surprising cinematic moments, but for the most part, you are going to be limited by your attribute. No matter how skilled you are at, let's say, wielding swords, you are limited by your dexterity. And if you want to wield heavier weapons, you are limited by your strength. So it's always that you roll a number of dice and you only get to keep a number of dice determined by your attribute, following the formula that I told you, r/k. So when you roll your dice, you add your highest dice that you are allowed to keep, and this will give you the total result to see if you succeed or fail at a particular task. You also have the benefits and hardships mechanic. That is, different things, different situations, some items or tools or powers will give you benefits and hardships in your roll. These benefits affect the number of dice that you can roll, and the hardships limit the number of dice that you can keep. So let's say that you have a dice pool of R4 and K2. A benefit would change that to R5, that is, you get to roll 5 dice and you only get to keep 2. But with that same dice pool, maybe you have 5 dice and you get to keep 2, but if a hardship is applied to it, then you would only get to keep 1 die. That is, 1 hardship equals minus 1 die that you get to keep in your roll. It may sound slightly complicated, but it's actually quite easy. But you could be thinking, that doesn't make too much sense. What if additional hardships are added? Maybe you get 3 hardships and your dice goes below 0. If that happens, you apply a -3 pre-roll modifier to the total. So if you added all of your kept dice and you got, let's say, 16, because of your -3, because of 3 hardships that you got, you only get 13. So skill checks in this game are very easy to carry out. It's the same mechanic. And sometimes the test will be unopposed, that is, you try to beat a certain target number. But other times you're going to be rolling against another character, so the highest number would win. Now when it comes to power levels in this game, it can handle pretty much everything. With the Quickstart guide, you only have the lower power levels, that is, you can play situations at a, let's say, street level or low fantasy level, but also you could handle things as classic fantasy or worldly power sort of heroes. If you wanted to have cosmic power adventures or epic high fantasy situations, you would need the complete core rulebook. But like I said, this Quickstart guide is quite robust. As long as you stick to power level 1, for example, like I told you, like street level, low fantasy, or you want to go a bit up, that is power level 2, you can do that. You have a table telling you the different target numbers and the information to have characters at that level of power. You also have additional information on levels of success and failure depending on how well or how bad you rolled. And you also have information on static modifiers, that is, some modifiers that could affect your roll before making the roll or after getting the results. Now let's talk about character creation. Each attribute is rolled randomly. This is to simulate having no real choice in a baseline of physical, mental, and social aspects of yourself at birth and throughout early childhood. Now, the number of attributes, like I told you, they are 13. You have physical attributes such as strength, agility, dexterity, and endurance. You have mental attributes, which are intelligence, knowledge, senses, and willpower. You have social attributes, which are presence, empathy, communications and influence, and you also have fate. Fate is a bit special when compared to the others. We will talk more about that later on in this review. And you also have information, like I told you, to create a character of a specific power level. When it comes to the different power levels, you have different tables. You make a roll and you compare it to the table, and in a power level 1 table, you will get somewhat lower attribute scores. That is going to be the norm or the basic benchmark for your character when it comes to attributes. And when it comes to power level 2, you have a better chance to roll higher attributes. There's also a chance to modify your attributes by flipping 2 of them. This represents how, through training and study and other means, you manage to change your natural aptitudes a bit. One thing that I forgot to mention in the quality, and it's actually a positive thing, is that there are many examples throughout the entire book, so it's going to be very easy for you to understand all of the mechanics. Players are also given 1 attribute point to add to their attributes, while adhering to the following rules. You may add 1 point to any attribute after flipping if an attribute flip is completed. The maximum value of an attribute is 4 for power level 1 characters, and 5 for power level 2 characters during attribute generation. You may not increase any attribute score higher than those limits. Now let's talk about how you determine your character's skills. Skills can be learned from formal education, work, trial and error. The ranks of a skill are between 0 to 10. So when you are selecting a skill, you are choosing to have a level of expertise that will assist you in many different tasks. In order to determine how many skill points a character has and where they can be spent, you total the attribute points in each attribute category, that is, in physical, mental, social, and fate categories. So you take these skill points determined by your attributes and you spend them in different skills of that particular category. That is, if you have, just to say a random number, you have 6 points of physical skills, you can only use those points to purchase skills in that category, in physical category. However, you must keep in mind that when you reach a rank that equals the attribute, then the cost doubles. Normally, you only need to spend 1 point to raise a rank in your skill. The exception to this rule is that if the attribute score is 1, then raising your skill to rank 1 also costs just 1 point. Now, when it comes to cross-category skill spends, you can take points from, for example, the physical category and spend them in another category, such as mental skills, social skills. But any skills purchased using points from another category also cost double. Now, when it comes to the fate attribute, this is a special type of category. Not all of your games are going to include it. Maybe you want to play a game that is quite gritty and realistic, so fate is more like for larger than life sort of characters. So you want an epic or high fantasy game, you would be adding the fate attribute, but in those games that do not, you need to ignore this attribute. But in case that you actually include it, you also have fate skill points, and they work differently than other skill points. They can be used for fate based skills as normal, but you can also use them in other attribute categories as if they belong to that attribute category, so they are quite flexible. You do not have to pay double for any other category when you use fate points. After that, you need to determine characteristics that are derived from these attributes. So for example, your wound level, which represents the opposing levels of success required to force a character to take a wound, is the result of adding 4 plus strength, plus endurance, plus willpower, plus resilience. So in similar ways, other characteristics that derive from the normal attributes are obtained, such as injury level, which is the opposing levels of success required to force a character to take an injury. You also have the wound threshold, which is the maximum number of wounds a character can take. You also have base defense, which is the basic defense score of a character, and you also have mortality threshold, which are the levels of success required for a defender to make an instant death roll. We will talk more about this later on when I describe how combat is handled in this system. You also determine abilities and flaws for your character. Abilities are obtained from specific training or boons a character was born with, and flaws could be genetic. There could be character flaws, lifelong injuries, etc. To obtain your ability points, you add your physical skill ranks together. That is, skills within strength, agility, dexterity, and endurance. you gain that many ability points to spend on physical abilities, for example, during character creation. You also do the same with the other categories, that is, you add your mental skill ranks together, you also add your social skill ranks together, and if you are using the Fate attribute, you gain your Fate attribute score as extra ability points that may be used on any ability, regardless of its category. Once again, showing that the Fate attribute is quite flexible. Now, ability costs are higher than that of other skill ranks. Abilities have a set cost that is listed with the ability itself. Ability points can be used to pay off the cost of abilities in full or in part when combining different categories of ability points together. Abilities are typically tied to one of the three attribute categories, that is physical, mental, social, and abilities can also originate from either the general or the Fate attribute categories. Ability points used to purchase abilities in the same category are worth 1 point against the cost of the ability. General abilities may be purchased with any ability point, that is, these abilities do not belong to any of the other specific categories, physical, mental, etc. So it's as if they belong to the same category, and Fate ability points may purchase any ability as if it originated from the same category as previously said. However, any other ability point used to purchase an ability outside of its attribute category is worth half its normal value. So this is different from when you purchase skills. In that case, you need to pay double, but in this case, the points are worth less. And this is important because many of those abilities can get quite expensive. So you may not purchase Fate abilities with ability points either. The points that you spend to purchase Fate abilities need to come from the Fate category. The character must meet any prerequisites listed in the ability in order to purchase it, and you must buy the ability in full. Now, when it comes to flaws and ancestry, that will be detailed in the core rulebook. Then you also develop a background for your character. Your career is also determined by the sort of skills and abilities that you obtain for your character. So this is a system that is not based on class. This is based on a certain archetype that results from your choices during character creation. You also determine your wealth and equipment. You do not have a specific currency. This is an abstract sort of system. So you basically use currency points when needed instead of counting coins or any sort of currency credits that you are using depending on when you are playing fantasy or sci-fi or anything. The Game Master may simply allow you to select gear that matches your background, or maybe the Game Master will require you to determine how many currency points you begin with. The wealth of a character is based on their influence attribute and their status skill. You make a status skill check, and the result is the character's starting currency points. You use these currency points to select your gear. At the end of this section of character creation, you have a complete character creation summary, so that you do not feel lost in the process. They even give you a full character creation example, so it's very easy for you to figure out the type of character that you can create using this Quickstart guide. And it's going to be even more involved and perhaps a bit more complex when you obtain the core rulebook and you can add flaws and ancestry. Then we have a chapter giving more details about attributes. There are 12 core attributes if you do not count the optional Fate attribute, and these are divided in 3 categories like I mentioned previously. So you have attributes that are pretty self-explanatory. When it comes to physical attributes, you have strength, which is raw force. You also have agility, which is the mastery of a character's body movements. You also have dexterity, which is the character's ability to manipulate objects with their hands and arms. You also have endurance, which is how well a character copes with fatigue, illness, and wounds. On the mental attributes category, we have intelligence, which is depicting the character's aptitude performing complex mental tasks. You also have knowledge, which quantifies how educated a character is in various subjects. You also have senses, which relate to how well attuned a character's 5 senses are to the world around them. You also have willpower, which is the force of personality, grit, and determination. On the social category, we have presence, which depicts the character's social skills and natural charisma. You also have empathy, which is how attuned a character is to others' motivations. You also have communications, which is how eloquently a character can relay information. And you have influence, which is the status a character holds over other people or lands. Now when it comes to the fate attribute, it could be many things. It could be luck, divine intervention, destiny, some sort of magical effect. So this is described in various ways depending on the setting where it is being used. Next we have a chapter featuring skills. Skills are a combination of trained activities and natural predispositions for proficiency. So you also have skills divided in different categories. When it comes to strength, you have athletics, access, bludgeons, which is quite useful to use blunt weapons, and those are just some of the physical skills. You also have agility skills such as acrobatics, dodge, drive, stealth. You also have dexterity skills such as bows, crossbows, guns, short blades, thievery. You also have endurance skills such as recovery, resilience, stamina. You also have intelligence skills such as animal handling, healing, investigation, sciences. You also have knowledge skills such as career, craft, literacy. You also have senses skills such as perception, reaction. You also have willpower skills such as courage, leadership, fortitude. You have presence skills such as acting, intimidation, seduce. You also have empathy skills such as detect lies, streetwise, deception. Then we have a chapter detailing abilities. Now remember, like I mentioned before, these are not bought on a one-for-one basis. That is, each of these abilities cost a number of points, unlike your skills that each rank is purchased by using just 1 point. In this case, you will have to spend several points depending on the cost. So you have physical abilities, such as ambidextrous. While performing the 2-weapon attack action, you take 1 hardship instead of 2 hardships. This will be detailed later on in combat. That is the types of attacks that you can do. You also have controlled. This is to wield unwieldy weapons so that you do not get so large a penalty when doing so. You also have lethal weapon. You are able to use a weapon to its maximum potential. You also have never say die. When making a death roll, you may use a courage skill check instead of a resilience skill check. You also have mental abilities, such as ear to the ground. When making an investigation skill check, add your streetwise rank as a pre-roll modifier. You also have miracle worker. When using the healing skill to heal wounds, you add 1 to the amount of skill ranks or attribute scores you restore. You also have the scientific method. When making a craft skill check, you may add your science ranks as a pre-roll modifier. Then we have some social abilities, such as ally. You have a powerful ally that can assist you when possible. You also have entertainer. Whenever you would make a status skill check to determine currency points or generate wealth, you make a perform skill check instead. So this is earning your living through perhaps acting or singing. You also have spy. When making an act skill check, you may add your deception skill as a pre-roll modifier based on your rank. You also have general abilities, such as lucky. When making any roll with this skill, you reroll any ones. So that's quite useful. Sometimes you get too many ones, but with lucky, that situation will be remedied. Then we have skilled. You add a +1 pre-roll modifier to each skill check. After that, you have a chapter detailing combat, containing all of the combat basics, how to set up the scene, and how to start things with initiative. When combat starts, each character makes an initiative roll. Initiative is determined by a reaction skill check and modified by any benefits, hardships, or other modifiers. Initiative signifies the character that initially acts first. Each character makes their first action in order based on their initiative rank. Now this is when things get interesting. Like I told you, this is a second by second type of combat. It's not divided by your conventional turns or rounds. You have a number of action points, and depending on the action that you are taking, you're going to have to wait more in line, in the initiative line, to act again. So maybe you do something that takes 4 or 5 action points. You will have to wait until someone that did something that only took 2 or 3 action points acts. So it all depends on the types of actions that you're going to do. You have to think if it's worth it to take a very significant or meaningful action, but that you have to wait so long later on to act again. However, like I told you, it's not as crunchy, that you have to take into consideration different objects and weapons that you are using. It's rather based on actions, on particular actions. So you have some basic details on how to set up a combat track. However, they do not give you a specific method, just some guidelines. If you haven't seen my video where I talk about Hackmaster combat, I talk about how I organize things in those types of situations. I recommend that you check out that video. I'm going to put the link in the description below because it's a useful, potentially useful diagram or matrix on how to keep track of these action points. Now, when it comes to melee combat, you have different options. You have the basic attack, defending, hitting locations. Now, when it comes to attacking, a player that wishes their character to make an attack determines what sort of action they will use. This character is now identified as the attacker. Once decided, they can determine what dice pool to form based on the offensive action and skill chosen. The attacker makes a skill check including any benefits, hardships, or pre-roll modifiers as usual. The total of this skill check is called the base attack value, and when he acts, the character immediately moves down the combat track a number of action points required based on the offensive action selected. So that's important. Remember, when you do something, you will have to wait a number of turns, so to speak, based on your action points until you can act again. So sometimes it could be worth it to take a few small actions that only require a few action points. It all depends on the situation, so there is some tactical depth to it. Now, when it comes to hit locations, every time you attack your opponent, you have to determine where the blow lands. So you have this table. You view the rightmost digit of your base attack value, and this determines the hit location. For arms and legs, if the number is odd, the attack strikes the left appendage. If it is even, the attack strikes the right appendage. Striking different parts of the body can also cause more or less damage. Striking the head increases the post-roll modifier of an attack by 5 after all potential reduction has occurred, so it's more dangerous. There will be more details about that later on. And if you strike the legs or arms, this decreases the post-roll modifier of an attack by 3 after all potential reduction has occurred. So it's more or less lethal depending on how your blow lands. If it lands on the head, obviously it's going to be more dangerous than if you just get slashed or cut in your arm or your leg. It's still potentially a hindrance, but not as lethal. Now, when it comes to defending, a player that controls a character that has been targeted with an attack may make a defensive action. Once a specific defensive action is chosen, the defender forms the dice pool based on the defensive action and skill chosen. The defender makes a skill check including any benefits, hardships, or pre-roll modifiers as usual. The total of this skill check is called the base defense value. The character advances down the combat track a number of action points required based on the defensive action selected. So as you can see, even defensive actions can take some time to carry out, and when it comes to the resolution, you subtract the base defense value from the base attack value. If the result is 0 or higher, the attack is successful. If not, the attack fails. What remains, if applicable, is called the base success value. And it's important to remember that 0 is a valid base success value. Sometimes your base defense value will be modified depending on the types of attacks and situations. Then it's important to consider post-roll modifiers. Once the base success value is calculated, you add and subtract any post-roll modifiers to the base success value. This is called the total success value. Post-roll modifiers are usually weapon damage and armor reduction, and post-roll modifiers can never reduce the total success value below 0. You also have a handy chart that summarizes the melee attack process, so it's going to be very easy for you to understand the different steps. Ranged combat is somewhat similar. It's almost the same, except that most ranged attacks cannot be actively defended. This means that in most cases a defender cannot use a defensive action to defend the attack. To make sense of this, you have range bands, and depending on how close or how far away your target is, it's going to be specifically easier or even more difficult. So you could think that a character that is too far away is always going to be very difficult to hit, but there are also some situations when, for example, if the opponent is adjacent to you and you are using a ranged weapon, then you're going to be attacking as if you are using a melee weapon, because your opponent could perhaps deflect your weapon, move the cannon of your attack, or the arrow if you are using a bow or a crossbow, push it away or even knock it aside. So it reflects that. And you also have another chart, which is the ranged attack summary, that also allows you to better understand the ranged attacks steps. Then we have details on wounds and injuries. They are the main factor in judging the overall health of a character. There are no hit points in this game. Each wound and injury is listed separately. So the wounds are tracked based on the hit location, where the wound was taken, and whenever a character takes a strike that causes a total success value of greater than 0, the target may take an injury or wound. Wounds and injuries are cumulative during combat. Benefits are also added as required, and when a character takes a wound or injury, the hardship applies to all rolls. So a wound is going to be taken if the total success value meets or exceeds the wound level of a target. The wound level is the result of 4 plus strength plus endurance plus willpower plus resilience. So all of your stats are quite important, at least when it comes to the physical category. And I think this is a great way to represent that you need both physical conditioning but also a mental power or a mental strength. A wound confers a single hardship, and this hardship is removed after the encounter, if there is time to rest. If there are successive combat encounters, it wouldn't make too much sense, so that's quite dangerous. So this game can get quite gritty, because all wounds add together up to their wound threshold to calculate the total wound hardship. Now when it comes to the wound threshold, a character can take only so many wounds before falling in battle. Sometimes the accumulation of wounds is as bad as suffering a mighty blow. When a character's total wound hardship exceeds their wound threshold, the character must make a death roll. If they fail the death roll, the character dies immediately from the accumulation of their wounds. So I think this is a great way to represent, for example, blood loss and the constant pain of trying to move your body while you have different slashes and cuts and broken bones, etc. If you succeed, the wound hardship is not added. The actual wound is still tracked as normal, with the total success value and hit location. In this scenario, the character takes an injury instead of a wound. This injury acts like any other injury with appropriate penalties applied, and any further wounds will trigger this process again. And if the total number of wounds suffered in one combat would ever double the character's wound threshold, the character dies immediately without a death roll. But that's not all. If a character suffers a total success value equal to or greater than their mortality threshold, they must perform a death roll or die immediately. Now when it comes to death rolls, they are rolled under several circumstances. Failing a death roll causes immediate death of the character. Characters make a resilience check and add their wound level as a pre-roll modifier. The target number of the death roll is the total success value of the attack. Wounds, hardships, and injury pre-roll modifiers are never calculated in death rolls. However, previously sustained wound effects may impact this roll, as they are neither wound, hardships, or injury pre-roll modifiers. If the character meets or exceeds the target number, they have cheated death. If not, they die. Now when it comes to injuries, an injury is taken if the total success value meets or exceeds the target's injury level, but does not meet or exceed the wound level of the target. Most attacks will cause an injury, as injury levels are low. An injury confers a -3 pre-roll modifier per injury, and the injury is removed after the encounter if there is a reasonable time to rest, like I mentioned. But there are some injuries that could stay for longer. After that, you have more details about the battlefield situation, like for example what happens in an engagement, moving as an engaged defender, what happens when you have multiple engagements at the same time, also the distances between combatants, movement and how to get behind cover, partial cover, and you even have a full combat example, so there is no doubt or question about the system when it comes to battle. And you even have a shorthand combat example just for a quick reference in case you are looking for something during play. After this, they give you more details about wound effects. Wound hardships accumulate during combat, and the wound effect must be determined for each wound a character takes. Wound effects are related to the total success value of the wound and their location. So there are severity levels. The first step in assigning wound effects for each wound is to determine the severity level, and then this is based on the character's wound level and the total success value of the wound. There are 3 severity levels: superficial, moderate, and terrible. They give you a table telling you which levels apply depending on the total success value as applied to the character that is suffering the wound. So basically each of these types of wounds, superficial, moderate, and terrible, apply a modifier to your roll, making it easier or more difficult for you to withstand the effects of the wound. That is, if you have only superficial wounds, it's going to be most likely that the wound effect is going to be quite mild. And if you have terrible wounds, well, you can imagine the opposite. So when it comes to wound effects, they can often impact a character negatively for the rest of their life, even when the immediate aftermath of the wound is long past. So you have 2 types of effects that you can suffer: those that are short term and during combat and that can be easily healed later on, and these other grittier consequences. Now, to determine those specific wound effects, you roll on a table based on the hit location of the wound, and you can get some critical results. That is, it could lower your affected attributes by 2, or some serious results that only lower them by 1, or some minor effects that could lower the skills associated with the attribute in question by 1. So as you can see, even if you decide to play a high fantasy setting, there is still a probability of your character dying or even getting severely injured. You do have a better chance to withstand this sort of damage, but there is still that chance that your character could suffer greatly during a combat. This is not a game where battles should be taken lightly. So maybe you get hit on your head and you take damage to your communications, intelligence, and senses. Or maybe it's actually something quite minor that only affects your communications. Maybe you take a cut to the torso and this results in damage to your strength, endurance, and dexterity. But maybe it's not so serious and you only suffer damage to, let's say, to your dexterity. You have a penalty when it comes to those checks or rolls. Maybe you get hit in your arm and you suffer in your strength and agility, or maybe just your dexterity, or maybe it's something related to your leg and you suffer some effect related to agility, endurance, and strength, or maybe it's a minor thing that only affects your strength a little. Now, you don't have names for these specific injuries. It's up to you and the game master to roleplay how these injuries play out, if you got cut, if something in your body got crushed, etc. Now, there is another important detail. If any of your attributes are lowered to 0, your character is considered unconscious, comatose. And there is another interesting detail. You can choose if you want wounds to take effect immediately during a particular battle or later on. I think it would work both ways, or maybe in specific cases, because sometimes in real physical confrontations, because of the adrenaline, you keep on going and you only notice the damage after that. But what if the wound is so severe that even with all of your physical conditioning and your mental power, you still suffer for it and you still find your body a bit more difficult to move? So in that case, it would also make sense for effects to apply immediately. However, if you decide to apply effects right away, it's going to take a bit more time during combat, so it's all up to you. Then you have details on healing. It can occur naturally or through aid. 2 attempts can be made to heal a wound, and healing is applied to any wound effect caused by the wound being treated. And of course, it's much better to have the assistance of a healer or a medic of some kind, so that you can survive those injuries, so that you can better heal your body. Now, after the combat section, you have a list of combat actions. Each combat action costs a number of action points. They are divided by categories. So for example, in the offensive actions, you have aim, you have assist, you have cautious attack, cold shot, and you can see the difference of how some things take a bit more time. And it makes sense because, for example, maybe you are making a cold shot. This requires more patience and concentration when compared to making a normal attack. And there are some really quick actions, like for example, assisting another character. Just to put things into perspective, the cold shot takes, for example, 4 action points, and assisting another character takes 2 action points. Remember, this is sort of like a second measure, a second by second sort of situation. So you have many other things with their respective number of action points or seconds to carry out, like charge, distract, full defense, interacting, interrupting, making an off-handed attack, trying to disarm your opponent, reloading, standing up, making a rushed attack. you want to attack really quickly and act right away. Although this does have its consequences, it's not going to be as accurate or as careful as other attacks. You also have 10 to injuries and wounds. You also have specific defensive actions such as block and parry, counter strike, defensive disarm, dodge, opportunity attack. So there's a lot of granularity when it comes to your choices of what you can do during a specific combat, as if things are happening right away or almost in a simultaneous way. Next, we have a chapter featuring equipment. Each of these weapons has its own aspects, that is, it deals slashing, piercing, bludgeoning damage, or some other type of damage. Like for example, there are some non-traditional weapons that deal magic damage, fire damage, etc. You also have qualities. Some weapons are adaptable, that is, they can be used either with one hand or two hands. Some weapons crush things, others are explosives, some are short weapons, some are long weapons. Some are mortal weapons, that is, this weapon does truly terrible damage and most defenders struck by this weapon are injured badly. And some others are ranged weapons, of course. So you need to keep all of this into consideration. And of course you also have some other characteristics like rate of fire in the case of ranged weapons, ammunition, the range of the weapon, the cost. So you will find any sort of weapon that you want for your particular character. When it comes to blades, we have daggers, short swords, great swords. When it comes to polearms, we have spears, long spears or glaives. You also have flails such as clubs, maces, warhammers. You also have axes such as hand axe, battle axe, long axe. You have medieval ranged weapons such as javelins, short bows and long bows. You also have modern ranged weapons like rifles, shotguns or full auto machine guns. You also have historical modern ranged weapons like the historical revolver, historical rifles and muzzle loading pistols. You also have futuristic ranged weapons such as laser pistols, laser pattern spreaders, full auto laser pistols, and semi-auto laser rifles. You also have armor with specific details such as armor reduction, and you can even buy the armor piecemeal, that is parts for each of your body parts. You also have armor traits such as the cost, qualities that tell you if the armor is difficult to wear or use. That is, you get a 1 hardship in combat because of this. Now when it comes to medieval armor, you have leather armor, chain armor, plate armor. When it comes to shields, you have bucklers, kite shields, tower shields, and maybe in the core rulebook there will be more to this. But if you wanted to play a futuristic science fantasy game, I think you could also use these medieval armor and shields as substitutes for some futuristic power armor and such, and perhaps force fields. You will only need to make the aesthetic changes, that is, you could use them as they are statted and just say, oh well, that's power armor, or that's force field, shield or buckler or whatever you like. After that we have the Game Master's Guide, with lots of advice on how to play a game of Heroes and Hardships, with more information on fate points and how to spend them. A character may spend a fate point in various scenarios, but once a character has reached 0 current fate points, they cannot spend any more until they are replenished, and this usually occurs after a session's or story arc's conclusion. It is up to the Game Master to say when they are replenished. You can use them to add a benefit to a roll, to negate fate point spends or burns, and add a minor detail to a scene. You can also burn fate points. This adds a 20 to a roll, pre or post roll. It's a modifier. You can also use them to ignore hardships, and you can add a major detail to a scene. In case you are not familiar with this, it's when your players decide that there is some sort of resource or some detail about the environment or the situation they are facing, or something related to a non-player character. They can introduce that in order to move the story forward and give them a bit of an advantage. You also have information on minions, which are NPCs that can offer a threat, but when they are together. Minions can only have 1 skill rank in any skill. Their wound level and base defense are calculated normally, but they have a wound threshold of 0, can take no wounds or wound effects, and make no death rolls. When minions suffer a wound, they die automatically. So they're kind of like cannon fodder. Minions cannot take injuries. Attacks that do not match or exceed their wound level are ignored. Minions have hit locations, which are subject to levels of success, but they do have armor reduction that covers all their body parts equally. There are also mobs, which are basically a group of minions. They can speed up things a bit if you want to have those huge battle scenes with many opponents fighting at the same time, but they still offer a lot of challenge because they are together. They are represented with a numerical value next to their name that indicates the relative strength of the mob, but does not necessarily indicate just how many individuals are in the mob. This is the mob rating. So for each mob rating rank, they add a benefit to any rolls that they take or they make. So this represents those weaker opponents that, because they are many, they are still somewhat cumbersome and potentially deadly if you are not careful, but they will go down as you start hitting them constantly and attacking them. That is, when mobs take a wound, they do not suffer a hardship, but their mob rating is reduced with each wound. That is, this represents how many minions within that mob are dying, and so they become less of a threat. But they always act together, and when a mob reaches a rating of 1, the mob is no longer a mob, it's just a normal minion. You also have information on unarmed combat that typically does not do lethal damage, but it can be quite deadly depending on the attack. Maybe in the core rulebook there's going to be an ability that allows you to be a martial artist, a deadly close quarters fighter. And near the end of the book we have a list of adversaries. We have medieval adversaries such as soldiers, medieval courtiers, healers as well, or spies, archers. You also have some more modern adversaries such as security officers, computer technicians, SWAT officers. The different adversaries could serve as main villains, as minions or mobs. You also have security robots, street samurai, etc. At the end we have an index, a hyperlinked index, so it's going to be very useful when you are moving through this entire Quickstart guide. So what do I think of the Quickstart guide for Heroes and Hardships? Well, obviously I cannot speak on the full system yet. I haven't seen the full potential of Heroes and Hardships with the additional stuff that will appear in the core rulebook, but I can tell you that this is one of the best Quickstart guides out there because it feels like a complete role-playing game. It is only limited by its options in character creation and probably equipment, and in the terms of character advancement. That is, you can easily use this Quickstart guide for many short campaigns or one-shot type of scenarios, but if you want a longer campaign where your character is constantly developing his skills and abilities, or if you want to add more details through, for example, flaws, or if you want more advanced character concepts, you definitely need the core rulebook. Now, when it comes to this preliminary view of the system, I like it quite a bit, but I think it's more for simulationist type of players. It doesn't get too heavy on the details like, for example, Hackmaster, which many of you know I love. It's my favorite fantasy role-playing game, but it gives you that bit of crunch. When it comes to combat, I think the crunchier aspect is the wounds, because the action point system is very easy to figure out, especially because you do not have to count the different weapons. That is, you get a number of seconds before you can use your Warhammer again. No, it's the same depending mostly on the type of maneuver or action that you are taking. But when it comes to wounds, I definitely recommend that if you want a more fast-paced game, that you factor in the penalties or modifiers of the wounds after combat. But if not, you can also handle it like that. Like I told you, I come from Hackmaster, and in that game you are constantly figuring out things during combat. See if your character fell unconscious because of a blow, or if he's going to bleed out, and if your character is tripping because it's very slippery on the floor because of the blood of your enemies. That could be too heavy when it comes to detail or simulation for some players. So if you wanted a simulationist type of system with some cinematic potential because of the exploding dice and the fate optional attribute, but you still have some finer details when it comes to combat, when it comes to see where the blow lands and how the wounds are going to affect the player characters, I definitely recommend that you try out this Quickstart guide for Heroes and Hardships. See if you like it, so that you can think about getting the core rulebook when it is released. And I also like it that it's a different take on the dice pool system. It's not roll your dice and count successes. This is roll your dice, you get to keep some of them. Maybe you get lucky and they exploded and you beat a certain target number, and depending on how you beat that target number, that determines the damage that you're going to be dealing and such. Well, thank you so much for watching this review of the Quickstart guide for Heroes and Hardships. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending DriveThruRPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, all the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.